It's one of those situations where you want to get out before you do any more damage. That's what.
That's how I feel.
Okay. If you've got a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn to the 22nd chapter of Acts. This is where we'll spend our time today. Paul is, last week, you remember he was taken by the mob that nearly beat him to death. The Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, very famous Roman commander, as a matter of fact, rescues Paul, allows Paul to speak to the crowd. And the crowd, Paul had said he waved his hand, the crowd became silent, but then he spoke to them in Aramaic, which is Hebrew at that time in history, and they became even more silent because they recognized that this is something very special that we need to hear. And I'm going to say God entered that moment as well. The fact that the crowd that wanted to kill him 5 minutes prior was now quiet enough to listen to Paul, that's something that God was doing. And last week we talked about certainty, and I fear I didn't listen to the sermon myself because sometimes that's a little embarrassing to listen to myself. But I mentioned the fact that certainty is something that we cannot find in this world. But there is a place that is more certain than anything we can find in this world, and that's to say, Lord, you are Lord. That's certain. And you and I can allow ourselves to fall into that certainty and find our lives a whole lot more easier to live. They'll be easier for us to live because we're not dependent upon ourselves at that point. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 22. A lot easier, not more easier. Sorry for that grammatical error. In Aramaic, Paul said, "Listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Paul said, "I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. Under Gamaliel, I was thoroughly trained in our law. And I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of Jesus this way, to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as also the high priest and all the council here can testify. I obtained letters from them to their brothers in Damascus and went there to bring the people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon I came near Damascus, and suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me, and I fell to the ground. And I heard a voice say to me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. 'What shall I do, Lord?' I asked. 'Get up,' the Lord said, 'and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that has been assigned for you to do.'" Here is, I'm going to say for every believer walking the earth, a secret to the profession of faith that we have. And that secret is an argument or a defense is not always the best way in. Sometimes the very best defense we can give is, here's what happened to me. I mean, who can argue with that? It's like if a person comes up to me and I say, "I itch. My back itches." How's anybody going to argue with that? Because that's a first-person direct experience. Well, it's exactly the same in our walk with the Lord. If somebody comes to us and says to us, "Well, prove to me that Jesus is Lord," I may not be able to prove it to your satisfaction, but one thing you can't deny, that's how I know him. It's a first-person direct experience between myself and the Lord that you can say whatever you like, but in the end, I'll not be talked out of that because I've experienced it. Just like if my back itches, you'll not talk me out of that fact. So this first-person self-referential explanation is where Paul starts. He's saying, this is what happened to me. But then he adds to it. This is where Paul is a really smart guy. He says, he points to the crowd and talks about the fact that he had persecuted the church. And he says to them, and I can only imagine the high priest must be in the crowd, because he says, as the high priest and the Sanhedrin can testify, I brought letters back from Jerusalem to Damascus to arrest believers. They know this. You see, they're standing in this crowd. They know that what he's saying is true, not just because Paul has experienced it, but because not only has he experienced it, but there are people there that can verify what he's saying. Man, this is a powerful, powerful apologetic. He identifies with the crowd. He says, I'm just as excited for Yahweh as you are. I love God just as much as anybody in this crowd. And he holds on to his integrity through the entirety of this little message that he gives. He never lets it go. He's identifying with them, but then there's a point of departure. And this is the place where, for us, there's always a point of departure. If you and I get to the place where we have a conversation with somebody about our experience with God, and they're not believers, there's going to be a point of departure. That point of departure is Jesus really is the Lord of the universe come in the flesh. God is real. He's alive. He's not just in my head. There is a reality here that you can't deny if you accept what Jesus has done in history. So there are all of these elements kind of placed together, wherein Paul takes what's a big 50-cent word, the existential truth of what he has experienced. All that means is, in reality, he experienced this moment in his life. He takes that and he couples it up with all the facts that these people that are in this crowd would know. They know that he's telling the truth. I guarantee you that the high priest and the Sanhedrin, who were probably listening to this address, they know in their minds they can't say anything here because they know that this is all true and that there are people around them who know it's true. Now you have to realize this is about 20 years hence. When Paul had his conversion experience on the way to Damascus, coming from Jerusalem with the letters to go arrest people, that's about 20 years ago. Paul's been gone a long time. But the person who was high priest in the Sanhedrin, a lot of them are still here. And they know that every bit of this is true. It's what's known in philosophy as a falsifiable fact. Let me give you, this is great. If you don't remember much about the sermon, which could happen, this is important. This is very helpful. If I tell you, let's say for instance, I say to you, go down to Moore's and go up to the counter, and sitting on the stool that's next to the counter, there's a pink elephant wearing a bow tie covered in polka dots. And you say, I don't believe you. Let's go check it out. But there's one thing you got to realize is that he disappears when you turn your car keys off. When you go up and turn the car off, the elephant disappears. Okay, that's unfalsifiable. You've got no way to check that out. If I tell you that I'm Superman, right? And the only reason you say, well, I don't believe you say, well, I am. You just have to take my word for it. How do I know that though, Rip? Well, I mean, I turn into Superman and I can fly and I'm stronger than steel and all that stuff. And they say, but I've never seen that. Yes, but you see, when I turn into Superman, you can't see me. How do you check that out? There's no way. That's what's known in philosophy as an unfalsifiable. And one thing about unfalsifiables, they are rarely true. Because there's no way to say, I went and looked. You can't do that with things like that. But what Paul is doing here, there's one aspect of what he says that's unfalsifiable. I experienced it. When the light came, I saw it. And I heard the voice, and the voice told me what to do. I've seen Jesus. You can't falsify that directly, but Paul takes it and couples it with all the things that can be falsified. All the facts about the Sanhedrin and the letters and the persecution that he was on his way to go do and the arrest of the Christians, every bit of that can be checked out. So what he's doing is he's taking the falsifiable and coupling it up to that which can't be questioned, that is within him. That's a powerful testimony, and all of us have that option. Sometimes people say, well, how do you prove that Jesus is Lord? You can't prove it in the sense that I can take litmus paper and dump acid on it and it'll turn purple. You can't do that, but what you can do is say, look at the history here, and then let me tell you what happened to me. When you put those two together, it's powerful, very powerful. So, anybody there who was willing could have confirmed everything that Paul was saying. But in the course of events, they're not going to get that opportunity. Now, this is where you and I become more powerful than we know in terms of what it is that God's given. If somebody came to you and said, I want you to tell me that you don't believe any of this. You don't believe that Jesus is Lord. You don't believe the Gospels. You don't believe the Bible is true. The only way that you and I could say that would be to deny our own conscience on the matter. If somebody came to you, Toby or Danielle, and said, Jesse and Coleman are not your children, you know it's true. For you to say that, you've got to deny your own conscience. This is the place at which God brings us to that point of integrity, personal integrity, wherein the only way that we can get out of what we're doing or what we've been called to in the moment, the only way Paul could escape this moment would be to deny his own conscience. That's the only escape Paul has. Yeah, you know what, you guys are right, none of this ever happened. None of this ever happened. But he can't. There's something here it's more than just a tactic. It's more than Paul trying to convince somebody of something. Let me tell you a little story. 1500s up to about 1550, King Henry VIII. You remember King Henry, right? Everybody remembers King Hank. He had many, many wives. And there's a joke that goes around in public speaking. You may have heard it. I'm going to use it. I didn't make it up. I wish I had. It's pretty funny in some ways. You get before a crowd and you say to them, don't worry, I'm going to treat you like Henry VIII treated his wives. I'll not keep you very long. And that's what he did. I mean, he went through them like water. He got tired of one and he said, you know what, I'm ditching her. Take her head off, I'll get another. That's what he did. And the reason for it was none of the wives were producing a son that he could have as an heir. Well, the first one he did this with was Anne Boleyn, who was his mistress, kind of one of the court women. I don't understand all about the king's court. I'm just relating the story. And he saw her and he thought, boy, she looks good. I bet she could produce a son with me. And by the way, it wouldn't be a bad gig to try. So I got a wife. What am I supposed to do? Well, I'm king. It's Rex Lex. The king is law. So he takes her as his wife, yet the marriage to the woman he has presently has not been done away with. So it's essentially polygamy. It's illicit. Well, Thomas More, famous person. There's a play and a movie about him, A Man for All Seasons. Thomas More was a believer, a devout believer. And he was part of the king's court. And King Henry said, I want you to come to the coronation for Anne Boleyn, who is the illicit wife who I'm taking on here while I'm still married to this other woman. And Thomas More said, no way, I'm not coming. And so they said, well, fine, we'll lock you up in London Tower. That's what they did. They locked him up. Well, one of the court officials who knew Thomas More, knew him as a person of integrity, said, I'm going to go visit the guy and try to talk him out of this. I mean, there's got to be a way. So he went to him and he appealed to him on the basis of the fact. He said, Thomas, all you got to do is just come to the coronation. I mean, what's the big deal? Thomas More said, let me tell you a parable in response to him. He said, there was a country where there was an emperor, and this emperor had passed a decree that no woman could be killed while she was a virgin. If a young woman were a virgin and she committed a capital crime, you couldn't take her life. And this woman committed a capital crime. She'd never been married. She was still in her maidenhood, and so couldn't put her to death. And the emperor, somebody came to the emperor and said, I got a solution for you. Take away her maidenhood, and then there'll be no problem to take her life. In other words, take away her virtue in that sense, and then your problems are solved. Now you can kill her. Kind of like what happens in Islam today. If a woman accuses somebody of rape, and they can't prove it, it's okay in Islam to say, well, you know what, let me take care of that for you. I'll make it so that you have been raped. Just to satisfy the requirement. Well, this particular moment, the man responds to the emperor's courtier and says, And Thomas More responds in this way. He says, they can take my life. They have that power over my life. But one thing they don't have any power over, it's to get me to deny my own conscience. That's how it is for us. You and I live in this world, and no matter what anybody does to us, they cannot take away our power over our own conscience. Only we can do that. This is exactly where Paul is in this moment. He is narrating all of this stuff. He knows it to be true. And for him to not say what he's saying in the moment, dangerous though it is, he would be denying his own conscience. He will not do that. You take my life, but you cannot take my integrity. Just like Thomas More. What is driving, and look, everybody in this room, if you know Jesus, I promise you, if you're willing and you say, Lord, I want to live for you in this world, there will come a point at which you and I will be faced with that moment wherein we have to deny our own conscience or we have to live up to it for Jesus' sake. What's driving this mob so mad? Two things. One, they recognize Jewish privilege. You see, the Jews, they misunderstood what God had called them to do and be. The Bible says they are the oracles of God to the earth. But you see, they didn't see that as a responsibility. They saw it as a privilege. They saw themselves as better than everybody else in that time in history because God did pick them out. That's true. He did pick them out. But it wasn't to make them better. It was to give them a responsibility to the whole earth. And that is to be the oracle of God. But that was one thing that made them so mad. The other was they saw in Paul him taking the life of God, the life of Yahweh, to the pigs. Taking the thing that made them different and handing it to everybody freely. That just made them so mad they couldn't stand it. So you'll see next week as we get into this conversation how this whole thing turns. Paul comes to this moment where he cannot deny his integrity. He knows that he's coming to that spot wherein he's going to say one word and it's going to turn the mob back against him. They're willing to listen to him at this point, but he's going to use a word and they're not going to listen after that. I'm going to say we are just like this mob in many, many respects in our own lives. What are our attitudes toward people who are not like we are? I mean, honestly, search your heart. Let's search our hearts for just a moment and say, are there people that we look at and we say of ourselves, we're better? We're not like that. We're not doing that. It's kind of like the Sunday school class. We see certain things as way worse than other things in our lives. God doesn't. God does not. So we come to this place wherein we're in the church. We're in church. You ever heard somebody say that? Are you in church someplace? Oh, in the South, that's commonly said. We want to hug God to ourselves and His presence to ourselves, and we want to think ourselves somehow better because of it in some ways. But that's not why we're here. You see, the Jews were to be the oracle of God to the whole world as a responsibility. That responsibility has now been handed to the Gentiles. This is the time of the Gentiles in history. It's not that God has said to the Jews, I'm done with you. It's just that now history has turned because of Jesus, and the time of the Gentiles is here. And Paul is part of that mechanism of taking the same Word of God that the Jews had hugged to themselves. He's taking it to the whole world because of the Messiah that the Jews have rejected. It is so easy, and I say this to myself and to everybody, it is so easy for us to become all foamed up about all of the evil we see in this world outside of ourselves or outside the church. We get real worried about what's going on in Congress. We get real worried about what's going on with the president. We get really worried about this group or that group and what they're doing and all of the evil they're in. That's fine. But do we ever stop? Do we ever stop and say, what about that thread of evil that runs through my own heart? That should give us pause to step back and say, except for Jesus, I'm just like that. There's no difference in me at all. James says this, he says in chapter 4, you adulterers and adulteresses, which, gosh, James, man, he said some really hard stuff. I would never say that. Don't you know that friendship with the world is to become the enemy of God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes themselves an enemy of God. Wow. You know, we have a choice to live within the integrity of who God's called us to be, to live within the integrity of the conscience we have. Like we said in Sunday school, we know when we're messing up. We know it. Or to let go of that integrity and be like they tried to get Thomas More to do, which is to say, look, man, just go in there and sit through the coronation. Who's going to care? It's just a small thing. Just let go of it today. That is not who God calls us to be, no matter what it costs us. He's calling us to be ambassadors for Him in this world. He's also calling us to live with integrity within our own conscience as He would dictate it to us. Which are we going to choose? And it is so easy to step back and choose the wrong thing, because it's always easier to live for myself than it is to live for others and for Jesus, always. I don't know where everybody is here today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to speak with me about this church, pray with me, I'll stay as long as it takes.